In our second unit, we'll be examining tribal societies, those that are egalitarian like the bands of Unit 1, but with larger populations and more complex social relationships. The first such society on our syllabus is the Nuer of South Sudan, one of the tribal societies most familiar to anthropologists, thanks to the pioneering work of E. Evans Pritchard in the middle part of the 20th century. Evans Pritchard was a British anthropologist who conducted extensive fieldwork in British colonial Africa in the 1930s and 40s. His careful and detailed work helped to set the standard for later ethnographies. We'll encounter him again when we look at the Azande in the next unit. For now, though, let's examine the environment in which the Nuer live. Their traditional homeland is in what is now the nation of South Sudan. When your textbook was written, this was still part of the larger nation of Sudan, but it gained formal independence in 2011, following the end of the Sudanese Civil War. South Sudan, and the Nuer's portion of it, is a landscape of rolling hills and grasslands. The region is dominated by the upper valley of the White Nile and its tributaries, which carries rain and snowmelt northward from the mountains to the south. While the northern parts of the Sudan stretch into the Sahara Desert, this part of the Nile Valley is well watered and can be quite green and lush. Water is most available seasonally when the rains and the southern snowmelt swells the rivers. Flooding of low-lying areas is common in that part of the year. In the dry season, the grasslands dry up and turn arid. The Nuer settlement strategy of shifting between permanent villages and remote cattle camps is an adaptation to this environment, fleeing floods in the rainy season and chasing increasingly rare watering holes in the dry season. The subsistence strategy of the Nuer is similarly an adaptation to this changing landscape. The Nuer get their food through a combination of horticulture and pastoralism. Let's examine horticulture first. Horticulture is, more or less, gardening. Many small tribal societies in Africa and elsewhere get their food this way. Horticultural societies cultivate small plots of land, growing a variety of crops with relatively little investment of energy. Horticulturalists do not fertilize their fields or engage in any sophisticated crop rotation schedules, so after a few years of harvests, the soil's nutrients have been depleted. When this happens, those garden plots must be abandoned and allowed to naturally replenish their fertility. Newer gardeners grow a combination of millet, maize, and several vegetable crops, and some tobacco, in plots immediately adjacent to their villages. Though they can usually bring in 2 harvests of millet in a year, the soils all around the village tend to be exhausted after about a decade of continuous farming. When that happens, the whole village will relocate to a new location to resume the process with more productive plots. Meanwhile, the primary source of Nuer economic activity is not farming at all, but pastoralism, the keeping of livestock, in this case cattle. Most pastoralists, like the Nuer, inhabit environments that have an adequate grass supply to feed the herds, but are otherwise unsuitable for agriculture. For the Nuer, the lower-lying parts of their territory are too prone to flooding to support farming reliably, and in the dry season the soils are too arid and compact for most crops to flourish. Instead, the Nuer keep large herds of cattle, which can move around the landscape following water sources, unlike crops to which water must be brought. Every dry season, as the landscape dries out, the young men will take the herds from the higher, drier ground to cattle camps in low-lying areas where there is still adequate water and pasturage to sustain the herd. However, people cannot survive on just animal food sources. Humans are biologically omnivores and require some vegetable foods to live. This is why the Nuer also grow crops when and where it's possible. Only a portion of the community goes to the cattle camps. The rest of them, women, children, the elderly, stay in the villages and tend to crops, harvesting them before the dry season reaches its height. This type of movement is called transhumance, where only part of the population moves with the herd seasonally and the others farm. Herding forms the economic and social core of Nuer society. Whereas farming is considered in many ways a supplement to their diets, cattle are the backbone of Nuer life. Evans Pritchard famously said of the Nuer, "Their social idiom is a bovine idiom," by which he meant to understand Nuer life at all, you must understand cattle intimately. In any pastoral society, the primary value of livestock is not meat. For the Nuer, cattle also provide a wide range of secondary products: milk and dairy, leather, fiber, bone and sinew, and so forth. The animals act as storage containers and resource factories, storing the grass food and converting it into useful materials, and doing so with a relatively low investment of time and labor on the part of the herders. Thus, by keeping large cattle herds, the Nuer can transform the essentially useless grass into a variety of useful goods. For this reason, the primary measure of a Nuer man's wealth is how many cattle he owns. More cattle means more of everything that cattle produce. Slaughtering an animal just to eat its meat would mean sacrificing all the potential wealth it could generate throughout the rest of its life. For this reason, most of the meat eaten by the Nuer actually comes from fish caught in rivers and backwater lakes. And because wealth derives from cattle, cattle become the measure of any form of economic value. This is especially true when we look at the economics of marriage. Among the Nuer, a newly married woman will leave her father's household and take up residence with her husband. The husband continues to live with or near his parents. This is a pattern called patrilocal residence. When a young man marries, he receives an anticipatory inheritance from his father in the form of 40 head of cattle. This will serve as the beginning of his own herd. He'll remain with his parents, brothers, and close kin, but he'll become primarily responsible for his own family's support. Thus, we see that 40 cattle is considered a minimum for supporting a family. Similarly, when a girl marries and leaves her father's home, the groom and his family will pay the girl's father a large bride price in the form of cattle. The exact count of cattle in this case is negotiated in advance between the two families. The more desirable the girl, the more cattle are paid. Young women are often highly productive members of the household, contributing to the family support in many ways. Simply losing one would be a great burden, and the bride price temporarily replaces her labor with wealth that can be traded or invested. Bride price also functions as a way of testing a future son-in-law's worth. Is he willing to pay a large bride price to marry the girl? If so, he's probably a decent man and truly dedicated to her. Is he able to raise that wealth and wealthy enough to just give it away? If so, he'll probably be a good provider for her and any grandchildren. In both the case of the groom's anticipatory inheritance and the bride's bride price, we see that the Nuer measure human labor and productivity in terms of cattle. Cattle also serve as metaphors for social relationships. Close kin often form cooperatives to assist one another in tending to herds. Nicknames are given to one another based on cattle in one's herd. And individuals take great personal pride in having the finest looking animals in the community. Thus, as Evans Pritchard noted decades ago, cattle inform every aspect of Nuer social life. Cattle also play a prominent role in Nuer spiritual life. Nuer religion, like the religious practices of many tribal societies, is concerned with maintaining relationships with various kinds of spirits. These spirits can form personal relationships with individuals, it's thought, and through them with their entire lineage or clan. As with most things in Nuer life, relationships with these spirits are managed through cattle. Individual cattle may be dedicated to particular named spirits, and it's through rituals concerning those animals that a person can interact with his patron spirits. Sacrifices of various kinds, not always of cattle, but sometimes, also facilitate such interactions. The Nuer organize their communities in a tribal manner. Let's review exactly what that means. Around the world, tribes can either be hunter-gatherers or farmers, sedentary or nomadic, but they tend to be gardeners or herders like the Nuer. The population of a tribal community is larger than a band, a few hundred to maybe 1,000 or 2,000. Like bands, tribal societies are egalitarian. Egalitarianism is a kind of social organization in which no group of people has special privilege or control over others. Everyone has an equal opportunity to participate fully in community decisions. No one is excluded, but some people obviously have more influence and sway than others. Insofar as there are any leaders, they're usually the fathers or elders of the community. They can negotiate with other members of the band, but they can't enforce their own decisions. As in bands, tribal politics are based on consensus. Tribal societies differ from bands, however, in their size. Newer communities can reach populations of several hundred, much more than the local bands found among the Zhuktwasi or the Tiwi. Keeping these larger communities functioning smoothly with an egalitarian, consensus-based political structure is much more difficult. The Nuer accomplished that goal through their sophisticated social organization, which Evans Pritchard called a segmentary lineage organization. A segmentary lineage organization segments its society into a series of larger and smaller lineages, and aligns groups politically according to their closer or more distant genealogical connections. In effect, it's a way to substitute genealogy for politics. First, we should note that Nuer society is patrilineal. Children of both genders belong to their father's family line. The mother's family is acknowledged as consanguineal, or blood-related, kin, but children are not members of her family and typically don't spend much time with those people. The smallest functional unit of Nuer society is called a minimal lineage by anthropologists. This consists of everyone descended from a common great-grandfather according to the patrilineal rule. Not every genealogical descendant belongs, therefore. The children of daughters are excluded because they belong to their own father's minimal lineage. Everyone in the minimal lineage shares a common great-grandfather. These minimal lineages are grouped together into minor lineages when those great-grandfathers shared a common ancestor of their own. Minor lineages are grouped into major lineages, all sharing an even more distant ancestor, and so on until, in theory, all Nuer are related to one another at some distant level. This segmented system of linked lineages serves a political purpose because it allows anyone at any time to know right away how closely related he is to anyone else. Consider two men, A and B. For A to know how closely related he is to B, he only needs to identify the smallest segment to which they both belong. If it's a small group, like a minimal lineage, then they are very closely related. If it's a large one, like a clan, then they are distantly related. And when comparing his relationship to B with his relationship to C, A knows right away who the closer relative is. Now suppose a dispute arises between B and C. Say, by an unforeseeable accident, C kills one of B's cattle. B demands compensation, but C refuses because it was an accident. With whom does A side? There are three possibilities here. 1. A is more closely related to B, in which case A sides with B. 2. A is more closely related to C, in which case he sides with C. Or 3. A is equally close or distant to both B and C, in which case he remains neutral in the dispute. In this way, disputes between close relatives remain small because most people in the village will be equally distant from both disputants. The dispute stays within the minimal or minor lineage and does not escalate. But disputes between members of different clans or villages will very quickly draw in most or all of the community, providing a strong united front against outside interests. When whole villages face off against one another, the risks of violence are so great that everyone is willing to step back and let cooler heads prevail. Thus, a segmentary lineage organization means potentially big conflicts are solved through negotiation, and smaller conflicts never become big problems in the first place. There is one kind of dispute, however, where it's seldom possible to let cooler heads prevail, and that's in cases of murder. When a murder has taken place, according to Nuer custom, it's the responsibility of the kin of the victim to seek retribution. If the murderer and the victim belong to the same minimal lineage, this isn't too much of a problem. The close kin of the victim are also close kin of the murderer, and everyone else stays neutral. It's also very likely that the murderer is genuinely remorseful and willing to pay compensation and make amends. But when the murderer and victim are very distant kin, the segmentary system can very quickly blow up. The whole community may be caught up in the dispute, and those seeking compensation may not even know the murderer or the victim personally. The murderer may also deny responsibility, and he'll receive the support of his extended kin in refusing to pay compensation. This might lead to the victim's kin killing a relative of the murderer in retribution, which might provoke another revenge killing, and so on. To avoid those intractable conflicts, the Nuer turned to the leopard skin chief. This figure is not a chief in the normal sense that we'll study in the next unit. He's not the political leader of the community, and he does not inherit his position. Instead, he plays a role similar to a third-party mediator. He usually belongs to the part of the community that would remain neutral in the dispute, so he has no stake in its outcome. A murderer will flee to his home after the murder and take refuge there. So long as he remains, the victim's kin cannot kill him in retribution. Meanwhile, the leopard skin chief begins negotiating between the two families to find a peaceful resolution, which usually means a series of very large payments of cattle from the family of the murderer to the family of the victim. Only when the deal is struck and the payments have begun can the murderer leave the leopard skin chief's house. Note, though, how this is still a fundamentally egalitarian structure. The leopard skin chief cannot dictate a resolution, and he has no authority to enforce an agreement once it's been made. Each affected party still has a full role in the negotiations, and an ultimate resolution is only reached when there is consensus on the compensatory payments. This will be very different from the kind of chiefly courts we'll study in the next unit. Finally, we should consider the drastic changes that have come to Nuer life in the last several decades. The nation of Sudan was a creation of British colonial policy and bore no relationship to the real cultural geography of the region. Consequently, when Sudan gained its independence from Britain in 1956, it was already a remarkably ethnically diverse nation. The north of the country was mostly desert, occupied by Arabic-speaking Muslims. The south was mostly peopled by black African groups who'd been missionized by Christian missionaries during the early 20th century. These two large blocks went to war with one another almost immediately. For most of the next 50 years, a protracted civil war raged between the north and the south. This forced the Nuer into an uneasy alliance with their traditional enemies, the Dinka, against a common Arabic foe. However, having a common foe never stopped the violence between Nuer and Dinka entirely. After South Sudan finally seceded from Sudan in 2011, the Nuer and Dinka went to war with one another almost immediately for control of South Sudan, and that round of violence continues, more or less uninterrupted, today. None of the dispute resolution mechanisms we discussed earlier apply when dealing with non-Nuer. So throughout the last 6 decades of violence in Nuer territory, the people have struggled to establish security and stability, often in tragic circumstances. Maybe the most tragic of these is the story of the Lost Boys of Sudan. Not all these boys were Nuer, but many were. Early in the 1980s, a series of northern Sudanese attacks on the south wiped out many villages. At the time, young boys, mostly between 6 and 10 years of age, were sent away from the villages to watch the herds. When they returned home, they'd find everyone they knew dead. These boys eventually coalesced into large bands of hundreds or thousands of refugees who walked across the deserts for months at a time, from one refugee camp to another. After years of hardship, many of these boys, some of them now grown men, were eventually given asylum in the U.S., where many remain today. A famous series of graphic novels called Echoes of the Lost Boys of Sudan recounts some of their stories. With the Nuer, we can see how tribal societies adapt to their environment, balancing the demands of horticulture and pastoralism, as well as how those larger communities manage to stay relatively peaceful. But with the Lost Boys, we can see how limited tribal organizations can be when faced with encroachment from the larger modern world system. Next week, we'll look at the Trobriand Islanders and see how they also balance egalitarianism with larger populations and confront the larger world around them.